Number 10. Barbara Opel. Barbara Opel needed money, and she was living with Jerry Dwayne Heyman, age 64, and his mother, 89. Including living with her 13-year-old daughter, she thought, hey, you know what? I know these old people we're living with has money, so I'm going to hire my daughter and her friends, or 5 teenagers, and tell them to steal $40,000 from Jerry and his mother. So she hired her 13-year-old daughter, paid $220 to a 14-year-old named Kyle, and his 13-year-old cousin $100, and a 17-year-old Jeffrey Goat to have a getaway car. The 5 teens ambushed Hyman and attacked him with knives and baseball bats. Hyman's body was found 8 days later in a shallow grave roughly 10 miles from the house, and Barbara's other children, aged 7 and 11, were instructed to mop up the blood. During the trial, Opel denied that she wanted him dead. In fact, she would say that she was telling her friends as a joke, I just wish he was dead. Not that he actually was dead. After all, language is important. But what was also important is the fact that she was found guilty and barely skimmed the death penalty, as the jury could not find a unanimous decision. Following her conviction, she was banned to contact her children or be in the same prison with them, as her daughter Heather pleaded guilty of the first degree at the age of 14. She received life in prison with a non-parole of 22 years, making her only eligible as of now, 2023, as she is now 36 years old. Opel is currently incarcerated at the Washington Correction Center for Women, and her case has been featured in shows with the episodes titled Mommy's Little Killers. Number 9. Buffalo Crime Family. The Italian-American organized crime syndicate have been also called as the Buffalo Mafia, located in Buffalo, New York. Like all other organized crime families, they have engaged in various criminal activities over the years, including extortion, racketeering, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and trafficking. They were also established in the 1930s, and over the years, law enforcement's efforts include successful prosecutions and increased scrutiny have weakened the Buffalo crime family. Additionally, internal conflicts and changing criminal landscapes have impacted its influence. The activities of the Buffalo crime family have a significant impact on the city of Buffalo itself and its surrounding region, and they have been involved in various criminal enterprises and have influenced the local economy and social dynamics. Last update of this family was of January 2022, as their power and influence has greatly diminished compared to its formative years. It's believed that the family's activities have become more low profile and focused on traditional organized crime enterprises.
Number 8. The French-Indian War. Wouldn't be good history without a war, and as far as wars go, this one was vital as it decided the continent's fate. It also wouldn't be a good war if there wasn't some really messed up stuff. The French and Indian War pitted colonist against colonist and Indian tribe against Indian tribe. It was war over land and trade disputes that not only had it affecting North America, but other large European empires all over the globe. Winston Churchill went as far to dub the French-Indian War as the true First World War. In the end, it left Great Britain victorious, and they seized a ton of land, forcing French colonists to flee southbound to Louisiana. All of this would eventually set the stage for the American Revolutionary War. Number 7. The American Revolutionary War. No taxation without representation. That's right, it's the war that gave birth to the greatest country on the planet. Go ahead, just ask them. They'll tell you. As far as revolutions go, this one is rather mild, but not without its bloodshed. The American colonists were sick of paying British taxes and having British troops occupy their cities, so after a tea party that was either really fun or not so fun depending on which side is telling the story, the colonists banded together and formed a militia, eventually turning into the Continental Army, led by George Washington. At first it looked like an easy win for the British Empire, outmanned and outgunned. However, after years of fighting, the British had no choice but to surrender. A collection of colonists managed to defeat the largest empire on earth in war. God bless America. Number 6. Bad diet. Imagine a brand new continent to explore, with things to see and resources to exploit. Sounds like a dream come true. Except, what's that smell? Oh man, it's colony cuisine. Oh, that's right. Even though the history books would make it seem being a colonist was fine and dandy, it was anything but. Specifically food. Being a colonist was difficult, especially if you were one of the earliest to arrive. Harsh winters made crops hard to grow, recipes were basic, and food was meant for survival, not indulgence. Things like corn, wild game, pretty much whatever you get your hands on. Oh, and don't forget, things had to be packed with salt in order to preserve them. Flavor, just like the Roanoke colony, was nowhere to be found. I'm getting thirsty just thinking about all that salt. Number 5. Military strategy. If you've seen a movie that takes place in the colonial era, you might see lines of redcoat soldiers with their muskets unleashing volley of lead and smoke on the enemy, who is also lining up to do the same thing. Why would you line up to get shot at? It seems impractical, but with the technology of the time, lining up to open fire makes a lot of sense. When in a line formation, it's easier to deal with cavalry charges. Staying strong in a line with bayonets drawn makes it difficult to be flanked, but perhaps the most effective reason was the colonial muskets were extremely inaccurate. Smoothbore muskets were infamous for having bad accuracy, creating a lot of black smoke, and just being tedious in general. Even the best soldiers require minutes to reload. So in order to fix this, just add more soldiers to hit your target. I'm still waiting for the 360 no-scope montage 1776 edition, guys. Number 4. Salem Witch Trials. You know them, you love them, gotta burn them. Witches. So the colonists thought. Back in the 1690s, people weren't as enlightened as us today. Once the townsfolk got a hold of some hearsay, it could very easily stir controversy and hysteria. The best example of this is the Salem Witch Trials. Whenever a young woman had done something deemed unsavory, she was declared a witch by an official. This got worse as times went on. Neighbors turned on each other and accusations quickly turned into the worst barbecue ever. Many young women were burned at the stake for reasons that more often than not were minor or no reason at all, with townsfolk coming up with a variety of different ways to diagnose bewitching and witchcraft. With a lack of scientific evidence for the accusations, even flat earthers are saying no. Number 3. It's all about the beaver. When French colonists arrived in the New World, it was quickly discovered that beaver pelts would make a profitable business. Not knowing it would help shape the economy and politics of the colonies, the beaver furs led the Europeans to exploring westward, discovering new lands, and for once, peacefully engaging with the Indians. The furs were so profitable that they even sparked a small war amongst Indian tribes, appropriately named the Beaver Wars. If they controlled the pelts, they could control the very profitable trade with new Europeans. Unfortunately for the mighty beaver, after more than 100 years of beaver hunting, it had a severe effect on the beaver population. It's comforting to know that even our founding fathers were destroying the environment for major profit. Number 2. The War of 1812. The United States and Canada share the longest land border on Earth, and that's strengthened by a strong relationship. However, that was not always the case. Back in 1812, the young nation that was the United States felt that the Canadian colonies to the north were not American enough, and probably just needed some America. The British, still feeling upset that their tea was dumped in the Boston Harbor, decided that the White House needed to be repainted, and aided the Americans by burning it down. Another war in colonial North America, but this one rather pointless, as when the war was over, border lines barely changed, and all that fighting was kinda nonsensical. Number 1. Colonizing the Continent. The most messed up thing about the North American colonies was the fact that they were colonies. European settlers came from all over Europe to exploit North America and its peoples for monetary gain. Although there were some settlers who treated Indian tribes well, a large percentage didn't. Eventually, when permanent governments were established, the Indians were constantly mistreated, manipulated, and destroyed.
Number 10 is it wasn't illegal to drink. Now that can be confusing since, as you probably already know, the purpose of banning alcohol was so that nobody drank alcohol. However, you'll learn today there was a lot of loopholes around it. For example, the 18th Amendment forbade the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. So by law, if you already had them in your home in 1920 when the law dropped, well, it was yours to keep and enjoy in the privacy of your own home. Most people only had a couple bottles, some had whole wine cellars, or some ran to the grocery stores to clear out the entire stock so they could have an legal stockpile at home. Number 9 is another loophole: how to hide the booze. Like teens at Coachella, the people of the 1920s wanted to sneak their alcohol around. So how did they do it? Well, some larger examples are faux books that were actually a flask, easy to bring to class or to your weekend visit at your mom's. Lamps and globes were also popularly converted into alcohol stash spots. Want something more portable for a movie theater or a park stroll? Well, how about a hollowed out cane or umbrella? Women even wore garters at the time, so they made tiny little flasks to fit in those as well. They're really cute. These tricks get more strange and messed up. One unhurried smuggler is documented being caught by US custom agents after he dropped a basket of eggs. The agents discovered that the smuggler had carefully poked holes in all of the eggs, drained them, filled them with alcohol, sealed them back up. There's even an example of a tailor using a tailor's dummy that was literally 12 pints of bottles sewed up by the tailor in the shape of its body.
Number 8. Tilted head. I don't think this is weird by any means, but it's too interesting to leave out. James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, he always had a head tilt in every portrait, and even in his daily activities, when he would talk to you, he would always tilt his head. He always looked interested. He did like that Larry David kind of, interesting, but he kept it in one spot. He looked engaged in the conversation, but he had the headshot attitude going even back in the 1800s. He would just cock, tilt, boom, eyebrow up all the time, always judging you. Well, it was believed by historians that he did this because he had a defect in one of his eyes. Maybe he wasn't paying attention at all during those conversations because maybe he had a headache that entire time. Today we believe he suffered from exodeviation, which is a wandering eye. Number 7, a baker's dozen. When we think of John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, and anything weird or scandalous that happened around him, obviously we're thinking of the whole Marilyn Monroe thing. The guy had more than one affair though. He had at least 13, maybe even more. Judith Exner was introduced to John F. Kennedy by Frank Sinatra. Yeah, it's not a bad introduction. At that time, Kennedy was hanging out with the Rat Pack. Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Exner was first to come forward and say that Kennedy wasn't that great of a guy, so pretty big deal. The Kennedy administration worked with mobsters during Operation Mongoose, and Exner at one point claimed that she was pregnant with his child. He was also at one point seeing a Soviet spy while he was working in the Navy. Her name was Ingrid Arvad. But his father told him to call it off because it would impact his political future. He also hooked up with a 19-year-old Mimi Alford, who at the time was a White House intern. That affair lasted 18 months, and perhaps the most interesting affair here was with Mary Pinchot Meyer. She was the ex-wife of one CIA agent. For one, is red flag city. I would not date anybody who's close to the CIA, father, husband, brother. No, I'm all set. But sadly, she was shot and killed in mysterious circumstances in 1964, just 1 year after Kennedy died as well. Many believe this was done to prevent Meyer from opening up about her affair. And as far as affairs go, this is just scratching the John F. Kennedy surface. If we do a part 2, I'll for sure add more to this list. Number 6, Prankster. Whenever I see those prank couples on Instagram, I can't even watch it. I don't do pranks. I don't want to be scared in the comfort of my own home. No, thank you. So when we look back on a president who did some weird stuff, Lyndon B. Johnson needs the spotlight for a hot minute here. This is a halfway point, so we'll throw in a kind of fun one. The 36th president of the United States had this bit that he would do to all of his guests. It was pretty hilarious. Let me explain. He did this funny bit where he was driving around his ranch and then he would pretend to lose control of the steering, like he wouldn't be able to stop or slow down. The whole car would just power off, and he would purposely drive, unbeknownst to his guests, he would purposely drive into a lake just to test the character out of the people beside him, because his car was also a boat. It doubled down as a boat. He had one of those James Bond boat car things that you could just drive into lakes. That's also pretty annoying, because I just know if that was me, I would have for sure jumped right out of the car. See you later, gang. Good luck. I'm tucking and rolling before I'm drowning in a car with Lyndon B. Johnson. No, that's not how I'm going out. Number 5, giddy up. Calvin Coolidge, the 30th president of the United States, received a pretty sweet gift. It was actually meant as a joke, but this is amazing. I would definitely want this. It was the 1920s. Calvin loved riding horses, but the unfortunate part was that he was also allergic to them. I get it, man. I'm allergic to cats, but every chance I get, I can't help myself. I want to inhale the whole thing. It's so cute. Little, I sneeze for hours after, but I'm like, you know what, it's worth it. I don't care if I can't breathe. But back to this gift, Calvin received a mechanical horse as a joke gift. But the joke went over his head. He loved this idea, as would I. Imagine having a mechanical horse bull riding thing in your dressing room. What a better way to wake up in the morning. The best part of waking up is not Folgers. It's that mechanical horse. Have you seen this thing? Get on. Just wake up and get bucked into your vanity every day. So loud. So many spilt things. Always picking things up every day, but worth it. Worth the fun. He would also wear a cowboy hat while he rode it too. So he was committed to the bit. He didn't just go on his pajamas. He was like, no, I gotta put on these boots and do a lot of this, a lot of dipping the hat. I can't even motivate myself to do at-home workouts. Meanwhile, this dude's getting whiplash in his closet. Number 4, throw hands. Roosevelt. The first president to win a Nobel Peace Prize loved to box. Sounds like a weird sentence. Yeah, that's actually how he went blind in one eye. It was a boxing injury. Again, this isn't weird per se, but like, imagine Biden doing a speech, then he just threw right hooks for 3 hours in a boxing ring. You'd be like, okay, that's a bit weird. I'm gonna ask some questions. Why is he so good at throwing hands? He's like 92. While he was president, his boxing days continued, but come 1908, he suffered from a detached retina. Did he quit boxing after this? Yes, of course. Did he also immediately move on to jiu-jitsu? Also, yes. It all began when Roosevelt was the governor of New York. He took up wrestling lessons from the middleweight champ at the time, which is pretty sweet. Imagine getting tapped out by Teddy Roosevelt. Number 3, card shark. 37th president of the United States, Richard Nixon, spent so much time playing cards and poker, and he was gambling during World War II that he actually got pretty good at it. Subsequently, he got pretty rich. The guy was like a James Bond villain at the table. He was so good. He earned a nickname after winning so many games in a row. They called him Tricky Dick. Nixon won so much money through gambling that he was actually able to later fund his campaign for the US House of Representatives in 1946. That's how he paid the bills. How sweet is that? Of course, at that point, he was playing cards with congressmen who were also like, oh, he's not that good. That's how you know they're sore losers. They're like, he's overrated. No, he just kept winning. He didn't lose any games, apparently. A US Navy officer reported that he never once saw him lose. I'm terrible at poker. I can't even keep a straight face, and also I don't know how to play poker, so there's that too. He once bluffed a lieutenant commander out of $1,500. That's pretty interesting, but at the same time, you're like, oh, our president's really good at lying and also loves to gamble? Interesting. Number 2, Saxman. Just like LimeWire told us those many years growing up, Bill Clinton did not have relations with that woman. Bill Clinton, the 42nd president of the United States, of course, is remembered for that Monica Lewinsky scandal, right? That was the whole thing, we remember that. That was weird and all, but did you know he can rip the saxophone? Yeah, I would get myself in an entanglement as well if I heard that in the next room. Are you kidding me? That music is like cinnamon to my ears. I want to just inhale that. We love a jazz sax, honestly. He was called the Elvis candidate at this point because it was definitely odd to just go and freestyle on the Arsenio Hall show days after winning the California primary, but you do you, honey. We're just watching. And finally, number 1, cherry jam. Turning the pages back to 1850, the 12th president of the United States, the guy I mentioned earlier, Zachary Taylor, the president nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, solid nickname. After only 16 months in office, he met his fate in a horribly strange way. It started out as a joyous 4th of July celebration in the Capitol, but things quickly went south. President Taylor was eating a large amount of cherries, and then he immediately chugged tons of milk. Don't do this. If you want to do this for some reason, if you're like, oh, I'm really craving that cherry milk combo as soon as I get home, don't do it. The acids, it'll just mess your shit up. This list has a good amount of silly stuff. I'm not saying this man's death is silly by any means. Historians are still trying to figure this one out, hence the weird aspect. Many believe he died due to gastroenteritis, which happens when you consume highly acidic foods such as cherries, then mix it with milk. So for days, Taylor experienced cramping, nausea, dehydration, just horrible stuff. His personal physician thought that he had a bacterial infection in his small intestine. Foul play is also brought up a lot here, but this cherry milk combo is just too fishy. What do you think? Comment down below. Kicking off the list at number 10, hot for teacher. Millard Fillmore, for one, looks strikingly similar to Alec Baldwin, but aside from that, he was also the 13th president of the United States of America. He became president in 1850 after Zachary Taylor passed away in an odd, tragic way, but I'll save that one for last. But Fillmore, this man had a thing for his teacher. Yeah, that's kind of a no-no, right? They were a couple years apart. Her name was Abigail Powers. And then the Miller Center of Public Affairs recalls that Miss Powers would often loan him books and encourage him to be on top of his studies. Come 1819, he proposed to her and she gladly accepted it. He was one of the only presidents who didn't have a vice president. Also important to note that he was not a great president in any means, historically. We're talking about these weird things on this list. I don't mean like awful decisions they made historically. I mean like this dude hooked up with his teacher when he was 19. We'll say that's weird for this video. That tidbit of information is strange, but as a whole, yeah, a lot of these guys absolutely sucked. Number 9, Daily Dip. As recorded in his diary from 1818, John Quincy Adams, the 6th president of the United States, loved to skinny dip. Yeah, this guy was part of Marky Mark Wahlberg's 4 a.m. workout club, I swear to God. In his diary, he would wake up every morning at 4 a.m., walk 2 miles to the Potomac River, get butt-ass naked, and then take a nice little dip. He would do some frog kicks totally naked, do some butterflies, the whole thing, just a nice workout all alone. And then he would walk home, I would assume / hope clothed. He was well educated, and on his off time he would read and skinny dip. Honestly, maybe that's the secret to life. Just grab Goblet of Fire and then take a new dip. That's it, you're feeling refreshed in 4 hours or less. 10 points to Gryffindor, hit that thumbs up. Let's move on.
Number 8, Turpin. The Turpin case refers to a severe and widely publicized case of harm and mistreatments in captivity involving the Turpin family. The case came into light of January 2018 when David and Louise Turpin were arrested for holding their 13 children captive in their home in Paris, California, to USA. Turpin children ranged in age from 2 to 29 years old at the time of discovery and were found malnourished, living in vulgar conditions, and subjected to severe physical and emotional harm, often kept in locked rooms with limited access to food and basic necessities. They were allowed to shower only once a year and were not permitted to engage in normal childhood activities, and the case came into light when one of the Turpin daughters, 17-year-old at the time, managed to escape through a window and contact the police. She used a deactivated cell phone found in the house to make an emergency call. David and Louise Turpin were arrested on January 14, 2018, and were initially charged with multiple counts of torment, false imprisonment, and more. They pleaded guilty to 14 charges. The Turpin case received significant media coverage and sparked a national and international discussion on harm, neglect, and the role of child protective services. But unfortunately, the same child services that were meant to protect the children of this family also resulted in them being in foster care systems that also failed them and caused more harm. In a general nutshell, a complete and utter disaster. Number 7, Sant and Kenneth Kimes. Sant and Kenneth Kimes were a mother and daughter duo involved in a series of notorious criminal activities including fraud, identity theft, and murder. Sant and Kenneth Kimes were a mother and son duo involved in a series of notorious criminal activities including fraud, identity theft, and killings. Sandy Kimes were born in 1934 and her son was born in 1974. They were involved in various fraudulent schemes including embezzlement, insurance fraud, and theft. They were used multiple aliases and false identities to carry out their schemes. And finally, after a fatal crime committed by the two, of the life of David Kasdan. Kasdan was a wealthy New York businessman who they had befriended and only had the intention of killing him to somehow attempt to steal his fortune. The investigation into the crime of David revealed a history of criminal activities by the Kemsies, and law enforcement agencies in several states had been investigating them for a several range of offenses. In addition of the crime of David, the Kemsies were linked to other criminal activities including disappearance and presumed killings of other individuals who had been associated with them. In 2000, Sant and Kenneth Kimes were both convicted of multiple charges, including death, conspiracy, and fraud. They were both sentenced in life imprisonment and without the possibility of parole. Number 6, the Bogals. In the case of the Bogals, that had ended after having 60 members of the family in jail or in prison. The statistics of this family is actually pretty extraordinary, and in the book I mentioned in the opening, In My Father's House by Fox Butterfield, discovered in his research of this family and how many members there were that were convicted at one point in their life. Looking at family values and behavior in the cases of the Bogals, they were actually very conscious of intimidating the behavior of their father and their aunts and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers, an opinion that been fundamental to our understanding of human nature since when it comes to the psychologist Harry Harlow demonstrated that a strong emotional bond with one's parents and a secure attachment can make all the difference in a child's emotional and social development. In this family, crimes include robbing, fraud, drug possession, child endangerment, death, drunk driving, kidnapping, physically harming somebody, strangulation, and so much more. But one member of the family decided to break the cycle, Ashley Bodle, as the first college graduate of her family in 150 years, and I wish Ashley a heartfelt good luck in her endeavors. Number 5, Gertrude Biski. Gertrude was an American woman who gained infamy for her involvement in the torment and death of Sylvia Likens, a 16-year-old girl in 1965. The case is often referred to as one of the most gruesome and shocking crimes in American history. Gertrude was a mother of 7 children. Sylvia Likens and her sister, Jenny Likens, were left in the care of the family by their parents who were traveling with a carnival. Gertrude was paid by the girls' parents to take care of them, and over a course of several months, Sylvia was subjected to extreme physical and emotional harm at the hands of Gertrude, her children, and several neighborhood youths. Apparently, one of Gertrude's children was very jealous of Sylvia. The abuse included beatings, burnings, and other forms of torture. And in October 1965, Sylvia succumbed to her injuries and died as a result of the prolonged harm. Sylvia's death was eventually discovered by authorities and charged in connection of Sylvia's murder. So the entire neighborhood was basically in on it. She was initially sentenced to death, but her sentence was later commuted to a life imprisonment, and she's paroled in 1985, but she died of lung cancer in 1990. Number 4, Rivera. Although the Rivera family's photos on social media suggest a very close group with a loving get-togethers, community service, and family outings, have an unfortunate strain of pain and remorse. Angel Rivera and his son Christopher Otero Rivera Montalvo, husband, had been arrested for killing of Nicole Montalvo. Wanda Rivera, the family matriarch, is accused of tampering with evidence and lying to investigators, and Nicholas Rivera, the family's youngest son, is considered a person of interest in Montalvo's killings. Montalvo's remains were actually found in the Rivera's property in St. Cloud and a vacant lot on Henry J. Avenue owned by Nicholas Rivera, who also faces 8 unrelated counts of possessing CP. The Florida County Sheriff Russ Gibson called it probably the most gruesome crime scene he has ever seen in 32 years of law enforcement. Little information has been made public about the investigation, and according to the judge leading the trial has said if the crime doesn't deserve a life sentence, then what does? Both Christopher and Angel were sentenced to life prison for second degree. Additionally, they both received another 15 years for dismembering a human body and another 5 for tampering with the evidence. Number 3, Debel. Lori Vallow Debel is an American woman who gained national and international attention due to her involvement in a complex and tragic case involving the disappearance and death of her children. Lori Vallow has been married multiple times, and her most notable marriage was to Charles Vallow, who died in July 2019, and then Chad Daybell, an author of an apocalyptic-themed books, where she married shortly after the death of Charles. Lori Vallow's children, Tylee Ryan, age 17, and Joshua J.J. Vallow, age 7 years old, were last seen in September 2019. Their disappearance raised concerns, and it was later revealed that Lori and her new husband, Chad, were uncooperative in providing information about their whereabouts. Lori and Chad faced increasing scrutiny for the law enforcement and the public. They were eventually located in Hawaii and were served with court orders to produce the children. Lori was arrested in Hawaii and extradited to Idaho, and she faced multiple charges, including abandonment and contempt of court. The remains of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow were discovered on Chad Debel's property in Salem, Idaho. Autopsy later confirmed their identity. Following the discovery of the bodies, both Lori and Chad faced additional charges, including conspiracy to commit death. Their cases gained widespread media attention. Number 2, Daniel and Jessica Groves. Noted in local news in Ohio, the parents of a baby boy was found dead in a well and have been guilty on multiple charges. The jury convicted Jessica Groves on all 11 accounts, including death, and Daniel Groves on all but one charge, aggravated death. The couple was convicted on what would have been their baby Dylan Groves' first birthday. Following their conviction, Jessica was sentenced to life in prison without parole plus an additional 32 years, and Daniel was sentenced to 47. The couple stood trial for their death of their 2-month-old son. They were arrested on June 2019 after Dylan's decomposed body was found at the bottom of a 30-foot well near their home. According to the county coroner's office, the 2-month-old's body was wrapped in plastic bags and duct tape and then placed in milk crates secured by chains, padlocks, and zip ties. Dylan's cause of death was determined as homicidal violence, and the child had survived multiple bone fractures and broken ribs, as well as methamphetamine and amphetamine was found in his system. The duo Daniel and Jessica were harmful and had purposeful damages, and Dylan had initially placed in the foster care after he was born with drugs in his system, but the failure of the foster system again allowed them to have access to their child again. That the case of Dylan had brought national attention to Ohio's opioid epidemic and the state family's reunification process. Even the director of the county's child services stepped down after the agent's mishandling of Dylan's case that resulted in his death. Number 1, Sackler. Speaking of opioid epidemic crisis, want to know who was responsible in a wider scale of this crisis? Yes, I know, maybe you have heard of them, considering they own a large pharma company that ended up going on bankrupt. But hey, don't worry, these rich folks are okay, as they later founded another company called Monte Pharma, which is a British multinational research-based company that located in the UK, Canada, Germany, and Singapore. Not a lot of people know about them, so it's worth noting who's responsible for the opioid crisis due to the irresponsibilities of this family. Geographically, specifically, the opioid crisis in the United States and Canada. And also, it's worth noting that they were called the most evil family in America, as well as the worst killers in history multiple times. And considering the fact that they had over 1,600 cases against them, as they persuaded the American medical market that strong opioids should be distributed. After all, in accordance to an article in 2022 by the Harvard School of Public Health, without urgent intervention of over 1.2 million people in the US and Canada will die from an opioid overdose by the end of the decade. But this family wanted to sell it anyway, because they don't care. And despite the bankruptcy they endured, the family still has billions of dollars. Forbes estimate that the family comprises of 40 members, still worth about $10.8 billion, so don't worry, these rich people are fine, but the many people who suffered under the addictions caused by their recklessness are not.
Scandal number 10 is the XYZ affair, which is a hell of a throwback as this happened during the French Revolution. So, President John Adams sent a delegation to Paris to work out some issues after the French started searching US ships that were en route to England. The delegation was ready to talk it through, but 3 French diplomats weren't even interested in breathing air near the men unless they were bribed to negotiate. This wasn't in the Americans' plans, so the deterred Americans came home. Meanwhile, American citizens are clamoring to know why the French were being so nosy of their commerce and why the government was, in their eyes, doing nothing. Well, John Adams, the president at the time, decided he had enough of the blame and made the meeting notes public, in which the French diplomats simply were redacted to X, Y, and Z. To quote, in 1798, less than a decade after the adoption of the Constitution, Americans learned that the French diplomats had refused to operate through the official channels to keep the two nations from war. It threatened to replace the new country's government of laws with a government of men whose private connections determined the national policy, says Heather Cox Richardson, professor of history. This led to an undeclared 2-year naval war known as the Quasi War. This war led to an American citizen, George Logan, taking it upon himself to engage in private negotiations with French leaders, suggesting them ways they could counter his government's position. This, as Richardson explained, put their fledgling government at stake. So, in 1799, Congress passed the Logan Act, designed to prevent foreign governments from working with private citizens to undermine American government policies ever again. Scandal number 9 is the Violator, aka Thomas Jefferson, the first president in American history to crack out an adultery scandal. Sally Hemings, one of the most famous yet least known African American women in US history, was one of Jefferson's many captured African forced laborers. And like the other captured women of the times, Hemings bore children fathered by her owner. It was a time when consent did not exist for these women, as they were property, thus had no legal right to refuse their owner's advances. And while this produced many mixed-race children, they would always inherit their mother's status as a forced laborer. This is the case of Thomas Jefferson's children, fathered by poor Sally, who luckily was smart as hell. She brokered the crap out of Jefferson and used the power of the P word to ensure her 4 children and herself received special privileges and treatments if
if he wanted her to stick around. Pretty impressive stuff, but sadly not the story for today, so we're gonna move on from that. In September of 802, political journalist James T. Callender wrote in the Richmond newspaper that Jefferson had for many years, quote, kept as his concubine one of his own Africans, adding that Jefferson had, quote, several children by her. Jefferson's policy was to ignore it and all public responses, making no explicit public or private comment on this question. Jefferson was allowed to continue his presidency because of his ignore it and it'll all go away tactic, but in 1998, a DNA test provided credible evidence that the former president fathered at least one of Hemming's 4 children. Not that you're gonna learn any of this in Hamilton.
Number 8. Hotel Monte Vista, Flagstaff, Arizona. I'm pretty sure we've heard of haunted hotels before. There are so many listed in the US, and sometimes there are tragic cases that occur in these places of temporary rest stops. In Flagstaff, Arizona, they're quite aware of the Hotel Monte Vista, a place where paranormal guests have truly overstayed their welcome. Apparently there's a sighting of a long-term boarder who had the habit of hanging raw meat from the chandelier in room 210. Another sighting was a pair of 2 women who were thrown from the 3rd floor and now attempt to choke male guests in their sleep. There's also a report incidences of an infant whose cries have sent staff members running upstairs from the basement just to find nothing. Even famous actor John Wayne had stayed at this hotel and had paranormal encounters during his stay. If you visit Hotel Monte Vista and their website, they even have on their page with all their listed ghost stories from the tenants that lurk in their establishment. There you'll find the raw meat man all the way up to the story of the bank robber who was part of a 3-man troop robbery in the 1970s. He was shot by a bank guard, and the robber who was shot was reported to linger into the Hotel Monte Vista bar and take a drink before he finally succumbs to his injuries. Both patrons and guests have reported being greeted by an anonymous voice saying good morning when no one was there. Number 7. Lincoln Park Zoo, Chicago, Illinois. I never thought to say this, but yes, even a zoo can be haunted. From zoos to chimps, apparently there's a new exhibit you can visit while you're on your trip to Chicago, Illinois. There are ghosts at the Lincoln Park Zoo. From 1840 to 1850, at the heart of the zoo lay rests up to over 35,000 bodies. But don't be alarmed, apparently it's because it was served as a city cemetery at this time. Most of the cemetery patrons were moved due to its proximity due to the city's water supply, but that doesn't mean everyone was evacuated. Like most horror movies, you know well enough not to mess with burial graves, and the Lincoln Park Zoo was no exception to that rule. But still, as if walking above several thousand corpses isn't weird enough, a famous parapsychologist, Ursula Belsky, once called the area, in its current state, one of the most active sites she has ever investigated. People have been reporting multiple sightings at the zoo since it first opened 150 years ago, from activities both visual and auditory manifesting in heavy atmosphere and physical effects like lightheadedness and nausea. In total, there are about 10,000 unmarked graves underneath, and so with that being said, just be careful where you walk. Number 6. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, New York City. Whenever you're on a date and your partner says they want to take you to 1 if by land, 2 by sea in New York City, you might be a little confused since that's the actual name. 1 if by land, 2 by sea is one of the most romantic restaurants in the world, with gold chandeliers, fireside tables, candlelights, upper crust cuisine, and about maybe 20 ghosts. Even in romantic settings, it doesn't stop the ghouls from gooing. And the spirits here, however, are more playful than the typical poltergeist havoc. As they are fully aware this is a place of fine dining, these paranormal activities include classic phenomenons like phantom pranks of flickering lights, tilting picture frames, and moving plates. Some of the most famous apparitions include a woman dressed in black who walks down the staircase. Others even claim Aaron Burr, wow, another Hamilton relation, who would have known, would have haunted the restaurant. Apparently the location of the restaurant used to be his carriage house back in the day. But despite these harmful pranks, there are still staff members that actually had to quit due to these experiences. The general manager, Roseanne Martino, says, yes, it's definitely haunted. I've had experiences. Inexplicable experiences. I've been there for 8 years and I have seen a lot. She's even noted sometimes there would be plates flying and staff members being pushed. But if she's been there for 8 years, I think the restaurant itself is worth checking out. Number 5, the Roth House, Wetzikon, Illinois. Another bed and breakfast with a rich history that dates back to the 19th century. With its interior aesthetics and glorious quaint agriculture, leaves many to stay in an extra evening at this historic abode. However, many might know this location by another name, the Wetzikon Wonder. The Roth House, however, holds another secret. It was here at this beautiful location where the first recorded exorcism in American history unfolded. With tales of paranormal activity dating back thousands of years, the land of Wetzikon, Illinois is a home to America's first demonic possession. The tale of Mary Roth when she was a baby. She had her first cataleptic fit, and incidents became worse when she grew. When the girl grew old enough to speak, she told her parents Dorothy and Asa that she could speak to spirits in her trances. When she was a teenager, Mary was able to read any book while completely blindfolded. Her fits would be so intense that it took up to 5 grown men to hold her down. She would self-harm quite a bit and said it was to relieve the pressure building up in her head. She would speak languages that she had no way of knowing and would hear voices and recite them out loud. Her parents, very desperate about her condition, sent her to an insane asylum where she passed away at the age of 19. Turns out Mary never left her her home, for another woman named Lurancy, who lived in the residence, told her mother one night that she wasn't feeling well. And just like Mary, Lurancy suddenly had the same symptoms of speaking in tongues, giving details of places she's never been to. She even told her parents that she's been communicating with spirits of the two older siblings who died many years prior. Apparently, Lurancy's body was inhabiting Mary's spirit, and even addressed herself as Mary. But there is a happy ending, somehow. Along the way, in Mary's voice through Lurancy, told her family that her spirit is healed and she will return soon. Months later, Lurancy went back to normal and spent her days in Watseka, Illinois. Those who visit the Rolfe house still notice spiritual activity as it continues to unravel to this very day, drawing curious folks if the house still hosts sinister spirits. Number 4. Moon River Brewing, Savannah, Georgia. The Moon River Brewing Company is probably one of the most haunted locations in all of Savannah, Georgia. Originally constructed in 1820, the building has served such purposes like a hospital, general store, and now restaurant. But each floor of the structure houses its own unique form of paranormal activity. From the entity known as Toby stays in the basement, lurking within the shadows, scratching and pushing passing tourists, least when expected. There lingers deceased former patients who stayed in the upper floor, shuffling around and talking audibly enough for patrons, visitors, and staff to hear. Guests have even reported seeing a lady in white on the stairs, and spirits have been known to be messing with staff. From the basement to the upper floors, ghost activity in the building proves to be rampant, as it has an enclave of history from the time it was a hospital, like the yellow fever outbreak to the horrible diseases that left memories within the building. Either way, despite the ghosts, the Moon River Brewing, being a restaurant today, serves up some fantastic brews and food. Number 3. Portland Shanghai Tunnels. In the late 1850s, Portland bars stretched the entire city block, and waterfronts was constant with international maritime trades. Beneath the old town Chinatown, which used to be Portland's original downtown, lingers under the city the Shanghai Tunnels. Tangled with myth and truth, the local lore of what lies beneath the city still remains a mystery, as accessibility to the tunnels are closed from the public, as well as its inaccessibility due to collapsed tunnels. The legend says that the tunnels was a labyrinth of interconnected basements, makeshift rooms, and low-ceiling tunnels that ran from the waterfront to sneak in illegal goods, including victims. Some say at its early years, the tunnel would be used as a secret passageway to underground brothels, opium dens, gambling houses, or used as temporary prisons for kidnapped men and women. Filled with terrifying legends of forced adult work, murder, ruined lives, and even an underground catacomb, leaves many to believe that the area to be totally haunted. But still, no archaeological evidence exists to prove these claims. But it would still be interesting to see what's down there. Number 2. Myrtles Plantation, St. Francisville, Louisiana. America has a lot of rich history, as it does devastating ones. Built in 1796 by General David Bradford, Myrtles Plantation has been noted as one of America's haunted sites. The house is rumored to be built on top of a native Indian burial ground, and it is home to at least 12 different ghosts. The story begins with a newlywed couple named Mr. and Mrs. Woodruff, who Mr. Woodruff was a prestigious judge and a proud owner of numerous slaves. But of course, Mr. Woodruff was also an abusive man, as he would beat his slaves at the slightest impulse, one of which was named Chloe. Chloe tried to protect herself from the pain by listening to Woodruff's conversations and trying to modify her behavior. But sadly, Chloe was caught by Mr. Woodruff, and her ear was chopped off for eavesdropping. Forcing to live with her mutilation, Chloe had to even request if she could wear a green turban to hide the terrifying mark. But the trauma and painful experience would stay with Chloe, and thus inspiring her to get her revenge. On the 9th birthday of one of Woodruff's daughter, Chloe accidentally poisons the birthday cake with an oleander leaf. She didn't have the intention to kill the family, but just to make them sick and nurse them back to health. Because to her, she thought healers are noted to be respected members of the community, and maybe I can get back into the good graces if I got them sick first and then nurse them back to health. Unfortunately, she ended up killing the plantation's owner's 2 daughters and his wife. Chloe was then hung by her fellow slaves, and it is now said that Chloe wanders around the plantation wearing a turban to conceal her severed ear. Number 1. Lake Lanier, Georgia. Finally, we are here at number 1. And as we mentioned in number 2, America has both great and tragic history. And the most tragic and the most haunted, in my opinion, is that of Lake Lanier. Lake Lanier is one of the most controversial lakes in the United States. Built atop multiple sunken communities and cemeteries, the lake still attracts tragedies of all kinds. Its dark past and haunted reputation has been a topic for many years. In the midst of 1950s, there has been nearly over 700 deaths, many of which are unsolved or unexplained. And about 200 deaths have occurred in 1994, and at least 27 has still not been found. So how did this lake even happen? Well, in 1946, Congress approved the River and Harbors Act, which aimed to bolster waterways across the country. Among was a project that was approved for $45 million for the soon-to-be named Lake Lanier, after Sidney Lanier, a Confederate Army vet. The lake's creation was controversial mainly because nobody ever agreed to it in the first place. 56% of the budget was to design and construct, and 44% was to relocate families, business, and churches. But that never happened. Instead, it took 5 years for it to fill the lake, and although the US government claims it displaced 250 families, on one account it was more like 700 families. And these families were primarily black families. In the 1920s and 1930s, there was a force out of black people and a mass transferring of their lands to white people. And in the beginning of the 1950s, the now white community saw the land value growing as much as the Atlanta population was, and so the water followed. The problem with Lake Lanier today isn't just from the basis of its history, but the fact that the lake wasn't even designed to be used as a recreational lake. It's just there. And although there are concrete buildings, cars, parts of bridges, and other debris in the deeper parts of the lake, the water is now receding and accidents just keep happening, adding to the debris. Lake Lanier has seen more than 500 boating accidents, including mysterious boats exploding into flames. It is said to be the most dangerous underwater surface in the US, and when floods come through and the weather gets extreme, it makes the lake more chaotic and difficult to find missing bodies. The haunted part usually happens if you choose to swim in the lake, as people have reported feeling hands, arms, or a leg and it doesn't move. Or when it does, it feels like it's trying to pull you down under the water with them. Number 10. The Peyton Randolph House in Williamsburg, Virginia. I'm a little bit of a Hamilton nerd, so when I saw that the American Revolution General Marquis de Lafayette stayed at the Peyton Randolph House, my interest peaked. But what really got me was that Lafayette had reported in his own journal spooky phenomenons that he himself documented. In 1737, Peyton Randolph House is situated in colonial Williamsburg and had a long history in haunted happenings. The house served as headquarters for the French forces in 1781 under the command of the General Jean Baptiste until the French and American forces moved into field positions around Yorktown. At the time, Lafayette noted to feel hands touch his or even push them when no one else was around, even try to push him down a flight of stairs. In 1824, Lafayette returned to Williamsburg to see where he had stayed during the Revolutionary War. Where he toured the US, he stayed once again at the Peyton Randolph House. He writes, "I consider myself fortunate to lodge in the home of a great man, Peyton Randolph. Upon my arrival, as I entered through the foyer, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It nudged me as if intending to keep me from entering. I quickly turned, but found that no one was there. The nights were not restful as the sounds of voices kept me awake for most of my stay." Today, the Peyton Randolph House carries more hauntings, like from the colonial Williamsburg security guard who got trapped in the basement of the house after entering through the shutter doors behind the house. He tried to make his exit as he heard a large and terrifying growl and felt something grab his legs as if firmly holding his feet down. He was stopped in his tracks when he was unable to move, and then suddenly the shutter doors slammed shut. His flashlight then also turned off. He quickly used his radio to call for help when his lieutenant finally came and pried open the cellar doors. They had to pry the cellar door open. He was released from whatever was holding him down, and then he quit the next day. 3 months later, he was able to get a much higher paying job. Good for him. Number 9. Builtmore Estate at Asheville, North Carolina. The incredible Builtmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina was built in the 1800s by George Washington Vanderbilt II. Vanderbilt's wife, Edith, turned the Builtmore into a private museum of luxury and would host lavish parties and entertain guests over extended stays. When initially built, there was no signs of any paranormal activity until after the Vanderbilt's passing in 1914, especially when his heirs decided to open the home to the public. When Vanderbilt was alive, he had a bit of a habit retreating to his library every time there was a storm approaching. His ghosts may actually be continuing this habit, as workers and visitors mentioned seeing a shadowy figure in the library, especially when there's a storm coming. His wife Edith was also noticed as one of the ghosts lurking through the halls. I mean, after all, it is her house. She was also known journeying through the library to remind her husband it was time to greet the guest. Today, many people would also hear a woman's voice echoing the name George, George, as she would most likely be summoning him away from his studies. Workers and visitors have reported hearing the sounds of clinking glasses, laughing, and music emulating through the halls, even sometimes splashing from the now empty swimming pool. It just goes to show you that even after death, you can still have a ball.
Number 8 is how alcohol survived as a drugstore prescription. One exception to the ban on distributing alcohol was that drugstores were allowed to sell medicinal whiskey to treat everything from headaches to the flu. By the way, what was more messed up here is that the fact that alcohol was being prescribed and how some doctors' orders were things like take 3 ounces every hour until stimulated. With a physician's prescription, you could obviously pick up a pint of hard liquor, and it was every 10 days that you were allowed to do so. Obviously, if you found a prohibition-hating pharmacist or doctor, it would be easy to schmooze or bribe or even just ask for an alcohol prescription and just be given one. Also, it's hard not to see profit, so many pharmacists and doctors started their own secret speakeasies, and then also many prohibitionists also operated under the guise of being these pharmacists and doctors to have these speakeasies as well. According to the prohibition historian Daniel Orkent, windfalls from illegal alcohol sales helped the drugstore chain Walgreens grow from 20 locations to more than 500 during the 1920s and into what it is today. Number 7's messed up fact is drunken husbands are literally the reason why women were the ones at the forefront of the prohibition movement. The anti-alcohol sentiment was on such a great scale with women, as in the times after the Civil War, they had just seen the returns of their beloved husbands alive, but they were always going to the saloons, which were particularly booming spots at the time. In short, many wives saw liquor as a home wrecker and were pissed that their husbands were coming home sloshed every day. Unfortunately, the drinking levels did lead to more reports of domestic discourse as well as poverty. Since so many women pushed for prohibition, it actually helped lead to women's suffrage, as male prohibition supporters and government realized if women could vote, they'd increase the votes in favor of prohibition to unforeseen levels and make the bill pass. So remember, if we did it once, we can do it again. Don't don't play with us. Fear-mongering is number 6, as misinformation and odd beliefs really did mess up the public perception of alcohol. Some unbelievable claims of the time were that alcohol would turn your blood into water, like a reverse internal Jesus situation, or that wine was made from crushed cockroaches. Another fun one is your brain would catch on fire from drinking, and seeing as hangovers existed, people used those as their proof. Secondhand smoke? Oh, what about secondhand alcohol in the room? Apparently the sight of alcohol could affect adults and children, so it must be hidden. What if you went blind from seeing it? Apparently your liver could grow 25 pounds from a beer a day, and if that didn't happen, then edema would get you. Prohibition-era enforcers really came up with a slew of untrue, unrealistic claims. This did cause an issue post-prohibition, as the fear-mongering was dismissed and people simply waved away the idea that alcohol could be bad for you for quite a long time. This obviously increased addiction as well as diseases perpetuated by alcohol consumption. Oops. For number 5, people converted to drink. Another loophole in prohibition law is that wine could still be consumed for religious purposes, something done in both Judaism and in the Catholic Christian religions. When prohibition hit, conversion and enrollment in churches and synagogues soared. It is significantly easier to convert to Catholicism or Christianity than it is to Judaism, so those were the first 2 choices of the 3. Many men preferred to avoid the circumcision that was required of them even in adulthood. Cities also saw a huge surge of self-proclaimed rabbis and priests who obtained their wine for congregations. When investigated, sometimes these congregations didn't actually exist. Similar to the pharmaceutical and doctoral industry, even a religious man could enjoy a little bit of a drink and find ways to ensure those around him could enjoy it too. Number 4, we see the birth of NASCAR. Okay, I know it's not necessarily messed up, but there is no way I could learn this and not tell you. Bootlegger cars were stripped framed, modded to the nines, and armored up. This is actually the same thing you'll see today with how NASCAR vehicles need to be stock, having traditional car bodies instead of those you see in the Formula 1s or the Indy cars. Bootlegger cars also had a false gas tank, removed back and passenger seats, and a modded engine and faux floorboards that aided in the $3 billion smuggle industry, when they weren't racing each other, of course. The act of racing wasn't only for fun, as it prepared drivers for police evasion using unique tricks and confidence in their ability to speed away safely without losing any precious cargo. A representative of the Mob Museum stated that many future NASCAR drivers cut their teeth bootlegging illegal moonshine in the 1940s, such as NASCAR Hall of Famer Junior Johnson, who won his learner's permit by running corn mash hooch before his NASCAR debut in 1955. Before and even after Prohibition came to an end, racing these high-performance cars became a popular pastime amongst runners in North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, and elsewhere in the South. They raced each other's cars, many of them Ford models, on weekend afternoons out in the country on makeshift dirt tracks, what would evolve into the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, or NASCAR, in 1947. Number 3 was waiting to watch the economy boom. Instead it slumped. Fantastically. Let's learn about it. It was expected in the dawn of the dry era that casual consumption would thrive. Clothing and household item sales would skyrocket, and leisure activities like artistic dance and theater productions would be selling out as people sought new forms of entertainment. Manufacturers were excited too, thinking that chewing gum, grape juice, and soda, all alcohol supplements, were going to be in the highest of demand. And with saloons closed, neighborhoods should be able to clean up, and new store spaces will be available, and that means a raise in rent, right? At this point, crime could even potentially disappear and clean, respected civilians take its place. So it makes sense for towns across the US to sell their jailhouses, right? Yeah. Man, they thought alcohol would change all that? Wrong! All across the board. Restaurants closed, having lost liquor profit, and theater revenue declined. Then came unemployment. Brewery, distillery, and saloon workers were out of work, but so were the barrel makers, the truckers, the waitresses, any trade relating to liquor. Instead of new stores opening up, everything was closing down, and now unemployment and poverty was on the rise. The rate of crime skyrocketed. Good job selling your prisons, because now you have criminals rising to the level of infamy still reputable in modern day. In whole, the economy was messed up big time from the government's decision, as was their social structure. This is something that took years to undo, even when alcohol was reintroduced into the public domain. Number 2, we see invading the space. What do I mean? Well, segregation was a law during the Prohibition era, but that was also when American jazz was starting to boom with young white Americans. Despite the segregation many of their parents encouraged and supported, young white people started to venture into black communities of cities like New York and Chicago to indulge in their speakeasies and their jazz bars. Now, this is a major majorly dicey violation of a community's safe space during a time when they needed to cultivate it, as they only had each other and faced discrimination from those outside of it. But white voyeurism brought economy into it. Dance crazes of the 1920s, such as the Charleston Foxtrot and Lindy Hop, were popularized by mostly the white crowd bopping along to the jazz music. This was great for the black musicians and prohibitioners alike, so came the begrudging creation of black and tan clubs, exclusively found in black communities. However, the interaction in these desegregated clubs were usually stylized, a watered-down, romanticized, and stereotyped version of black life that was more palatable for the new flow of white consumerism. As a result, black and tan clubs were more symbolic than any real socialization or actual mixing. Some clubs allowed anyone to enter, but then they would stretch a rope across the dance floor and bars so that white and black dancers wouldn't mix or use the same bar sides. Many clubs would cater to black clientele during the day and then switch to only white people at night, with black musicians only being present. Sometimes they were purely white clientele with black staff no matter the hour. So while white socialites who felt themselves to be progressive pleasure seekers infiltrated these clubs under the guise of cultural appreciation, it left black artists, staff, and customers of the time to stay wary in the communities they should feel safe in. For number 1, we hear about government poisoning. As you heard from one of our previous points, the government really boofed this whole thing and got pretty much every assumption wrong. So, like petty children, they kinda lashed out in the worst way possible. In their effort to minimize illegal consumption, the US government believed that by poisoning illegal alcohol, people would be discouraged from drinking it. The poisoning was done by processing the illegal hooch through filtration, so they became industrialized alcohols, which means it's undrinkable and used for things like medical or mechanical. A good example is hydrogen peroxide, and I encourage you not to look up what happens when you drink that. Instead of discouraging people, in 1926 there were reported 400 plus deaths as a result of this government initiative, and a year later in 1927, 700 reported deaths. Originally, smugglers found tricks around this, and they managed to filter the alcohol to be resold again. Unfortunately, the government simply used different techniques to ensure the poison stuck, knowing full well what would happen when it reached the consumers.
Battle of the Frogs. 1754 was a time of war between vast empires. Many battles took place, but none more unusual than the Battle of the Frogs. That's right. One night in Windham, Connecticut, all was well, until townsfolk began to hear this awful noise. And no, it wasn't Island Boys. At that moment, it was suspected to be an attack from the French. Townsfolk began to amass and gather weapons, as angry mobs are known to do. Alas, there was no attack. When morning came, people began to discover that what they thought was an attack was actually a pond full of frogs, verbally fighting over the last spots of water that had dried up in a recent drought. Hundreds of lifeless bullfrogs lay in the wake of the Wicked Frog War. So wicked that it had earned 3 ballads written about the event. Movie rights, anyone? Number 9. The Disappearance of Row Oak Colony. Row Oak was founded in 1587 in hopes that it would give England a permanent trading post in the New World. Relationships with the local natives hadn't been going too well and were complicated to say the least. So later in 1587, the colony's leader John White went back to England for supplies. Unfortunately, he was slowed down by the Spanish Armada. And of course it takes months to sail by ship. These aren't exactly speedboats after all. When he returned, he was surprised to find that everyone had disappeared, including his family. And all that was left was a wooden post with an engraving. To this day, we have no idea what happened. My theory is John left and the rest of the colonists were like, "Oh, finally, this guy's gone. Let's get out of here."
Scandal number 8 is the Teapot Dome. Before there was Watergate, which don't worry is coming up on our list, there was the Teapot Dome, which at the time was the greatest and most sensational scandal in the history of American politics. President Warren G. Harding, who sat in the Oval Office during the time of the scandal, is often regarded as one of the worst, if not the worst, American president of all times. Described as corrupt and chaotic, even though it's said that most of the dodgy dealings of his administration supposedly happened without his knowledge, such as the Teapot Dome. So this starts in the presidency of William Taft, who designated many oil-producing areas as naval oil reserves to ensure the Navy would never go without fuel. Fair enough. Bounce forward to Harding's time as president, and his Secretary of Interior, Albert Hall, convinced the president in 1921 to shift control of a number of those reserves, including the one at Teapot Dome in Wyoming, to the Department of the Interior. Fall, the sneaky little bugger, then leased those reserves to private oil companies without competitive bidding. No competitive bid means brokered deals. brokered deals means the government, or at least Fall, was getting a massive paycheck. After an angry Wyoming oil operator wrote to a senator complaining of this secret deal, an investigation by the Senate committee followed. They discovered that Fall had received around $400,000 in bribe money to facilitate the leases. Congress ended the leases, and Fall became the first sitting cabinet member in American history to be sent to prison. Although Harding was never directly implicated with the scandal, via association his reputation was forever tarnished. Scandal number 7 is everyone's favorite, the I did not. Come on now. If you can't finish that sentence, you're too young to be watching this. Or maybe not, because you'll learn a thing or two about the smooth and savvy former President Bill the Sax King Clinton. This dude was hilarious during his day, appealing to the youth and giving off the cool guy vibes that no president candidate had before. It's what earned him his place in office. However, those cool cat ways should have been left in his cool cat days because Bill crossed a line. Bill Clinton is famous for getting caught getting it on with the White House intern Monica Lewinsky, who would forever change berets, cigars, and blue dresses in the minds of the American people. The whole fiasco starts because Monica confided in her friend and Pentagon employee Linda Tripp. Linda had a big fat flabbering mouth and just snitches to Kenneth Starr, a lawyer and judge working on harassment claims with former state employee Paula Jones. This was a big fat lotto ticket for the judge, who blew the story right open, prompting Bill's famous speech and line, "I did not have relations with that woman." The House of Representatives moved toward impeachment for obstruction of justice and perjury, but the Senate saved him with an acquittal in 1998. Scandal number 6 is the Katrina criticism. On 2005, Hurricane Katrina, a Category 3 storm, hit New Orleans, Louisiana, and had some catastrophic effects on the city and surrounding areas. People were drowning, washed away, and President George Bush was playing guitar in San Diego while country singer Mark Wallace egged him on. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's response was sorely lacking as residents struggled to survive in the days after the storm had passed. People stood on rooftops waving their arms up at helicopters and planes desperate for aid, and folks in the Superdome appeared in heartbreaking TV interviews begging for supplies, search and rescue teams, literally anything the people could provide. Instead of heading right to the devastation area as was done by President Lyndon B. Johnson when Hurricane Betsy struck in 1965, Bush surveyed the damage from Air Force One on his way home from vacation, and outcry ensued. As stated by Vanity Fair, unlike Ronald Reagan after the Challenger explosion or Bill Clinton after the Oklahoma City incident, Bush had failed to feel the profound implications of the moment as his predecessors had. The insensitive flyover made affected Americans furious, as did the photo of him quite literally looking out his jet window down at the chaos, and it led to Kanye West stating that Bush doesn't care about black people during a Hurricane Katrina telethon, and an opinion that widely spread alongside the statistic fact that 67% of New Orleans was African American and 30% of the residents were poor. The lack of aid made by the government was blatantly neglectful of its minorities and less fortunate. This scandal was one of the few that led to Bush's end. Scandal number 5 is the Iran-Contra affair. As put by Time magazine, during the early 1980s, President Ronald Reagan faced 2 major dilemmas. The militant group known as Hezbollah had taken American hostages in Lebanon, and a new revolutionary communist government had been established in Nicaragua, Central America. So Reagan and that big head of his alongside the administration devised a plan to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. What if they sell arms to Iran so that maybe Hezbollah would release the people, then funnel a portion of those profits from the arms sales to provide military support to the Contras, who were the anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua? Sounds like a plan, only problem is it's super illegal every step of the way, violating the Boland Amendment that banned US funding rebels and the US trade embargo with Iran. When news broke of the illegal arms deal, Reagan initially denied it up and down, as negotiating with terror experts was something he had previously sworn never to do. In a later televised address to the nation, however, he would go back on that promise and publicly admit to the illegal trade. Congressional hearings followed, but none resulted in convictions. Addressing the nation once more, Reagan denied knowing the full extent of his administration's actions, but of course took full responsibility for them. Scandal number 4 is the Eaton Affair, which for context, this shit happened in 1829 to 31. So you need to know that, because while what happened would be far from a big big deal now, it was a big fat stinky problem pile back then. So in the first 2 years of President Andrew Jackson's terms, his Secretary of War and good buddy John Henry Eaton married widower Margaret Peggy O'Neill. Yay! Congrats, John, good stuff. They met because she was the daughter of the owner of a boarding house that Eaton held the land deed to, meaning she was just your everyday gal. However, she became controversial because of her reputation for promiscuity, and the fallout led to Jackson dissolving his entire cabinet. Why in the hell was that so scandalous? In Washington, in the 1820s and 1830s, women were still enforcing strict societal standards on each other. Purity was an essential requirement for any proper woman, and since Peggy Eaton was believed to be immoral, having remarried only 9 months after her husband's death, she could not be accepted into high political society by the cabinet wives. No proper woman could exchange visits with her, invite her to social functions, or be seen exchanging pleasantries with her. Sure, she might be the wife of the Secretary of War, but she was still a suspect woman. Meanwhile, Jackson's own wife, prior to her son passing in 1828, had been subject to similar bullying that he believed contributed to killing her. So when his best friend's woman came under fire, Jackson immediately rose to her defense. According to Joanne B. Freeman, a professor of history and American studies, the scandal split the Jackson administration into 2 camps. Jackson and the Secretary of State Martin Van Buren supported the Eatons, while much of Jackson's cabinet decidedly didn't. Vice President John C. Calhoun joined the anti-Eaton forces partly because he opposed Eaton's support of protective tariffs, and unable to resolve the problem through personal persuasion, Jackson ultimately forced pro-Calhoun, anti-Eaton cabinet members to just resign in 1831. Van Buren and Eaton also resigned to allow Jackson to appoint an entirely new cabinet. Scandal number 3 is the Credit Mobilier scandal. So, in 1872, a company called Credit Mobilier, a phony construction company set up to build the Union Pacific Railroad, aka funnel money, used its fraudulent bonds and connections to bribe the top officials of President Ulysses S. Grant's admins. This was the Vice President, Speaker of the House, Congress members, a whole mixed bag. The bribe was to secure federal support and funds to build a transcontinental railroad that made them and the bribed politicians very rich people. Now, this bribery happened before Grant took office, back in 1867, but the scandal didn't come to light until 1872, making it his problem to address, especially since it was one of America's earliest political corruption scandals. The New York Sun newspaper published an expose of the scandal on September 4th of 1872, and it name-dropped all the congressmen involved. And in the thick of sitting President Grant's re-election campaign, the story included correspondence between a private investor and a US rep, and reported that the sham corporation was granted $72 million in railroad building contracts when only $53 million was actually spent. The public outrage and numerous news editorials led to 2 White House committees and 1 in the Senate to investigate 13 congressmen. Manisha Sinha, a professor of history, explains that it was a prime example of corrupt crony capitalism that plagued the US government. The tragedy of the Credit Mobilier scandal was that it discredited Grant's administration even though the president was not involved in it personally, and by extension, discredited the administration's Reconstruction policy of protecting black rights against white terror in post-Civil War South. Scandal number 2 is Watergate. How could it not be? It's the presidential scandal to end all scandals. To quote Louis C.K.'s 2013 comedy bit, "These days people are like, the president is kinda disappointing." Really? Our president wept like an insane person, then got on a helicopter and flew away. And that's exactly what happened on August 8th of 1974, directly after Richard Nixon became the first and only president to resign from the role, thanks to this scandal and the snowballing of so many others. That and Watergate is when English language adopted the suffix gate to suggest the existence of a scandal. So Nixon, you're 2 for 2 on legacies here, bud. This nightmare began June 17th of 1972 with a break-in at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in Washington, specifically their Watergate complex. 5 men are caught going through files and attempting to plant listening devices, and horrifically, the breadcrumb trail eventually leads back to Nixon's Republican administration and even to the president himself. Naturally, investigative journalists carry the world on their shoulders, and they manage to uncover the multiple times Nixon exploited his power, including attempts to cover up their involvement with the break-in, a dirty tricks campaign against Democrats, illegal wiretapping of enemies, using the FBI, the CIA, and the IRS as political tools. 69 government officials were indicted as a result of these discoveries, and 48 are found guilty. Facing certain impeachment, Tricky Dicky, as he was called, stepped down and declared to the American people, "I have always tried to do what is best for the nation." And scandal number 1 is the Halpin scandal. Raunchy scandals are nothing new to presidents, as you probably already knew before even hearing all those previous on the countdown. However, these men, like JFK, Warren Harding, Clinton, to name a few, all got away with it, but there was one scandal that straight up annihilated a president president's time in office. Described as the most despicable intercourse scandal in American political history, the acts of President Grover Cleveland are a shameful golden star dangling above the heads of all other ornery presidents. Cleveland was in the White House during the late 1880s, the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in office. While he wasn't anything special, dude is remembered as Grover the Good, which is a hell of a reputation stretch. During his 1884 presidential election, Democratic Cleveland went up against Republican candidate widely regarded as corrupt. And as corrupt folks do, and politicians alike, to aid their campaign, the Republicans looked to find dirt on Cleveland, and boy did they find it. Turns out Cleveland had fathered a child out of wedlock some 10 years earlier with a widower named Maria Halpin. However, in an affidavit given by Maria, their baby was not conceived through consensual relation. After a meal out together, Maria was brutally violated by Cleveland by use of force and violence without my consent. When the child of her violation was born, Cleveland used his extensive connections to have the boy removed from his mother and placed in an orphanage, and Maria is thrown in a lunatic asylum to keep her silent. Somehow, Cleveland survived this public revelation when the Democratic spin doctors countered with an aggressive smear campaign, not against the Republicans, against Maria of all damn people. They did this by portraying her as a drunken harlot who wanted it, whilst Cleveland was the honorable gentleman who took responsibility for the child, since he was the only one of Maria's male friends who was a bachelor. The spin worked, and Cleveland won the close-fought election. Thankfully, those who knew this story was utter BS worked really hard in the limelight to free Maria from the asylum, which she was, but the woman was traumatized and lived her life with the stain of the scandal and the violation forever.